When Keanu Reeves walked into one of the most luxurious restaurants in Los Angeles, dressed in a simple gray polo shirt and a pair of comfortable khakis, no one bothered to notice him. To the staff, he was just another ordinary middle-aged guest, someone who didn't belong there. And that was precisely when Amanda, an ambitious yet arrogant young waitress, made the biggest mistake of her career. With a polite yet condescending smile, she tried to usher him out, believing he was just an unworthy guest, completely unaware that he was not just a diner, but the owner of the entire restaurant. And then, true to his signature calm demeanor, Keanu Reeves turned this evening into an unforgettable lesson in respect, humility, and true class. A lesson that no one at Grand Oak would ever forget. Before we continue the story, let us know where you're watching from. If you love inspiring stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any exciting new content. Los Angeles, a city of lavish dreams and people constantly chasing fame. At its heart, Grand Oak stood tall as a symbol of pure sophistication. The glow of crystal chandeliers cast a warm light, reflecting off fine wine glasses. The smooth melodies of jazz intertwined with the soft clinking of silverware on porcelain plates. The delicate laughter of women in dazzling gowns, and the hushed conversations of tech billionaires discussing their latest investment ventures. Here, everything was perfect, from the meticulously arranged floral centerpieces to the exquisitely plated dishes that looked like works of art. This place was not for the masses. It was the domain of those with power, wealth, and impeccable taste. And then a man walked in. No Armani suit, no gleaming Rolex watch, no bodyguards, no display of grandeur. Just a simple gray polo, a pair of comfortable khakis, and an old pair of sneakers with no recognizable brand. The man carried himself with a quiet composure, unfazed by the exclusivity of the restaurant. He didn't glance around for approval or seek anyone's attention. He simply made his way to a small table in the corner, not too conspicuous yet offering a clear view of the entire restaurant. A waiter approached. "What would you like to order, sir?" "Whiskey, whatever the house recommends." That was all. No inquiry about the expensive menu, no interest in the elaborate cocktails young businessmen were ordering to showcase their sophistication. He simply ordered a whiskey, as if he'd been here countless times before. But none of the patrons recognized Keanu Reeves. A Hollywood star should have been in a tuxedo at glamorous galas, surrounded by high-profile producers. Yet here he was, sitting quietly, unnoticed. Not that it mattered to him. For the past 6 months, Keanu Reeves had been the secret owner of Grand Oak, but he had no desire to make it known. He didn't need special treatment. He wanted to see how the restaurant truly operated when there were no celebrities around. However, there was one person who had no idea who he really was. Amanda Miller, a young waitress who, just a few months ago, had been a top student at a prestigious hospitality management school. She was eager to prove herself, desperate to enter the world of the elite, and above all, she believed that Grand Oak was no place for ordinary people. She glanced at the man in the polo shirt with a brief frown, an expression that anyone with a keen eye would recognize instantly. "He doesn't belong here." Amanda scanned the restaurant, where every guest seemed like a perfect piece in the lavish mosaic that Grand Oak had meticulously crafted. Young entrepreneurs in tailored suits, each stitch reflecting the opulent glow of the chandeliers, tilted their heads attentively as their partners discussed the next million-dollar deal. Women with glossy lips and expensive designer handbags, placed neatly on the seats beside them, chuckled softly while scrolling through their phones, checking the number of likes on their latest social media post. The air of luxury wasn't merely a product of the extravagant architecture or the artfully plated dishes. It was created by the very people who occupied this space, the elite, those who didn't just dine here but used this place to assert their status, to display their class, to prove to the world that they belonged in a setting like this. Yet, just a few steps away, a stranger sat alone. He wasn't dressed extravagantly. He wore no luxury watch on his wrist, no glittering accessories designed to draw attention. Instead, he sat quietly with a simple glass of whiskey, utterly indifferent to the unspoken rules that every other guest followed so meticulously. No one in the restaurant knew who he was. No one looked at him with admiration or the familiar reverence reserved for those of significance. But what unsettled Amanda the most was his demeanor, completely unbothered, not the slightest bit hesitant, as if he fully believed he had every right to be there, as if his presence required no one's approval. Amanda couldn't understand how someone could sit there so calmly when it was obvious he didn't belong. As a server who had worked at Grand Oak long enough to grasp the restaurant's unspoken rules, Amanda knew that guests like him weren't the clientele they catered to. Grand Oak wasn't just a dining establishment. It was a symbol of status and power, a place where wealth wasn't merely measured by the price of a meal, but by the aura people carried, the brands they wore, the way they spoke, every word laced with the confidence of those who had conquered society's heights. And that man, in his overly simple attire, with his entirely unremarkable appearance, was not part of that world. Amanda glanced toward the reception desk, where a group of young businessmen stood waiting, glancing impatiently at their watches as the reservation list remained full. She could hear them discussing their latest investments, their voices filled with the energy and ambition of people accustomed to being prioritized in every situation. They were the type of guests Grand Oak wanted, people who didn't just spend money, but elevated the restaurant's reputation with every photo they posted against its dazzling backdrop, drawing envious eyes from those who could only dream of stepping inside. Yet here this unknown man sat, taking up a valuable seat, a spot that should have belonged to someone truly deserving. Deep down, Amanda didn't despise guests like him, but she had worked here long enough to understand that Grand Oak wasn't just any restaurant where anyone could walk in without regard for standards. She believed her job wasn't simply about serving food. It was about ensuring that Grand Oak's elite atmosphere remained intact, that every guest felt they were in an exclusive space where not just anyone could enter. She had encountered similar cases before. People who walked in without grasping the caliber of Grand Oak, those who dressed inappropriately, those who thought they could indulge in luxury without proving they belonged. And each time, Amanda knew exactly how to make them leave. She never had to be rude or directly ask them to go. A few well-placed words about the restaurant's standards, a subtle suggestion that another place might suit them better, a carefully crafted message, gentle yet firm enough to make them realize they weren't welcome. Most of the time they would leave quietly, without protest, unwilling to create a scene in front of the restaurant's distinguished clientele. Amanda glanced at her watch. The restaurant was getting busier, and the wait list was growing longer. She knew she had to act now. Adjusting her uniform, she picked up a menu, her practiced smile in place, and walked toward the man's table with steady steps. She would make him understand that Grand Oak was not meant for him. Amanda stepped up to the table with absolute confidence, her lips curving into a professional smile, yet her sharp gaze betrayed an unspoken evaluation. like she had already made up her mind about the man sitting in front of her. She had done this plenty of times before, met countless guests who didn't quite fit Grand Oak's image, and each time she had a way of making them understand they didn't belong, without ever needing to say it outright. Stopping by the table, she leaned slightly forward, deliberately creating a power gap between a prestigious restaurant staff member and a patron who, in her eyes, failed to make an impression. Her voice was gentle, polite, but carried an implicit suggestion that anyone perceptive enough would recognize. "Sir, I noticed you've been sitting here for quite some time with just a glass of whiskey. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the bar." It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a message. A man in an expensive suit could sit as long as he pleased with only a single drink. A group of young entrepreneurs could chat for hours over vibrant cocktails. But a middle-aged man dressed as plainly as this, he wasn't afforded the same privilege. Amanda paused for a moment, expecting to see signs of discomfort, hoping for the familiar flicker of hesitation, for the glance around the room before he quietly got up and left, like so many others before him. But all she received was an unnervingly calm gaze, one devoid of unease, void of hesitation or embarrassment. He simply looked at her, steady, observant, reading her without needing to say a single word. "I like it here. The whiskey's good. No excuses, no explanations, just a simple statement, yet one that carried an unshakable serenity, as if nothing could disturb the stillness within him." Amanda wasn't used to this kind of response. She had encountered countless guests before, had served plenty of self-assured, powerful individuals, but all of them had something to prove. They had a reason to assert their presence at Grand Oak. They came to be acknowledged, to be admired, to reinforce their own importance. But this man? He seemed to have no such need. And that, more than anything else, unsettled her. She didn't like people who failed to pick up on the unspoken cues she gave. She didn't like those who didn't understand their place. But most of all, she despised the feeling of losing control over a situation. Keeping her poised smile intact, she tilted her head slightly, her tone still soft, though now laced with a subtle firmness. "I'm just concerned that this table has been reserved for our regular patrons." This time, she wasn't implying. She was stating it outright. In her mind, this man should understand that he had no right to sit here, that this space was reserved for people Grand Oak truly wished to serve. But Keanu remained unmoved. He placed his whiskey glass gently on the table, his movements slow yet deliberate. His eyes remained the same, calm, deep, as if he were watching, waiting, observing how she would proceed. "I understand." Two simple words, yet they carried a weight that Amanda couldn't quite define. Something solid, immovable, like she had just walked straight into an invisible wall, something she couldn't dismiss as easily as she had with others before him. Normally, when she made a statement like this, the person across from her would immediately get the message. They would quietly leave, understanding that it was not worth pushing back. But this man showed no intention of leaving, and that left her with an unfamiliar sense of unease. She had always been in control. She had perfected the art of making people disappear without ever having to raise her voice or explicitly tell them to leave. But tonight, things weren't going the way she wanted. She felt her patience wearing thin. A slight crease appeared between her brows before she quickly masked it, but this time her smile wasn't quite as flawless as before. "I'm afraid," she began, lowering her voice slightly, as if to emphasize the importance of what she was about to say. But before she could continue, a voice interrupted from behind her, causing her to stiffen instinctively. "Miss Amanda, maybe you should call the manager." The voice belonged to Miguel, a young waiter who had been standing nearby, his wide eyes taking in the situation unfolding before him. Amanda snapped her head around, her gaze sharp, and for a fleeting moment, the frustration she had been keeping under control surged to the surface. "Miguel, you're a waiter. Stay out of this." Her voice had lost its earlier softness. It was sharper now, firmer, carrying an unmistakable warning. Miguel took a small step back, but his eyes remained steady, as if he knew something Amanda didn't. Keanu still said nothing. He simply observed, his expression patient, as though this was a scene he had watched play out many times before, as if he were merely waiting for the inevitable to unfold. And Amanda, though she refused to admit it, felt, for the first time, like she was stepping into an invisible trap, one she couldn't quite figure out how to escape. But she wouldn't back down. If subtlety wasn't working, perhaps it was time to be more direct. For the first time that evening, she felt a flicker of irritation slip into her tone. She was not going to let this man get what he wanted. Amanda squinted, feeling a sharp wave of irritation rising within her as things refused to go according to plan. While the man in front of her remained seated with an eerily calm demeanor, she could sense the growing attention of the people around them, gradually shifting in her direction. This had never happened before. Normally, situations like this would resolve themselves quickly. The guest would pick up on the subtle cues, show a hint of embarrassment, then stand up, find another spot, or simply leave. But this man was different. There wasn't a single sign of discomfort, unease, or even offense in his expression. Just absolute composure. A kind of calm that Amanda couldn't quite explain. It was a stillness that suggested he already knew exactly what she was going to do next. And that infuriated her more than anything else. She cast a quick glance at the group of young businessmen still patiently waiting near the front desk. They were the kind of clientele she truly wanted to serve. The ones with money, with status, the ones who knew how to present themselves according to Grand Oak standards. Some of them were beginning to grow impatient, occasionally glancing her way as if expecting her to handle this situation swiftly. She couldn't let this drag on any longer. If subtle politeness didn't work, she would have to be more direct. This time, her smile sharpened, though her voice maintained its usual artificial sweetness. "Sir, our menu is quite exclusive, and the prices—" She deliberately let her words trail off, allowing her gaze to sweep over Keanu's simple attire, lingering briefly on his unbranded gray polo shirt and plain sneakers, shoes that no man of real wealth would ever choose to wear in a place like this. "Reflect the prestige of our establishment." As soon as the words left her mouth, a suffocating tension spread through the air. At the adjacent table, an older couple, longtime patrons of Grand Oak, paused their conversation and turned to look. The husband frowned slightly, clearly displeased with Amanda's tone, but before he could say anything, his wife gently placed a hand over his, signaling for him to wait and see how things unfolded. A strange silence settled over the room, a silence that felt heavy. Amanda's words hadn't been explicitly rude, but everyone could sense the unspoken message behind them. It wasn't just a reminder about the prices. It was a blatant insinuation that this man couldn't afford to dine here, that he didn't belong in this space, that he was simply wasting a valuable table in a high-class restaurant. She had said similar things before, but this time the atmosphere felt different. Not far away, Miguel, a young waiter, was clearing a table when his hands suddenly froze mid-motion. His heart pounded as recognition dawned upon him. The man sitting at the corner table wasn't just any customer. It was Keanu Reeves. Miguel had grown up watching every one of his movies with his father. He had memorized his most iconic lines, had dreamed of one day meeting the man his father had always admired, and now here he was. Not on a movie screen, not at some glamorous premiere, but right in front of him, in the very restaurant where he worked every single day. But he couldn't believe what he was witnessing. A man respected by the entire world, a man known for his humility and kindness, was being treated as if he weren't even worthy of sitting at a table here? There was something infuriatingly unjust about it. Miguel knew that Keanu Reeves was not the kind of person who flaunted his wealth or status. He knew that the actor never cared about appearances or material excess. But he also knew one thing for certain. If there was anyone in this world who deserved nothing but the utmost respect, it was him. And right now, watching him being spoken to like this, Miguel couldn't stay silent any longer. Without a second thought, without worrying about the rule that employees should never interfere in guest matters, Miguel turned around, looked directly at Amanda, and spoke with quiet but firm conviction. "Miss Amanda, maybe you should call the manager." A simple sentence, but it rang out like a bell, shattering the tense silence hanging in the air. It was as if the entire restaurant had just come to a standstill. Amanda stiffened. She couldn't believe it. Miguel, a waiter, a nobody, had actually dared to speak up. And not just anywhere, but here, in front of everyone. Her eyes turned ice cold. The patience she had been carefully maintaining up until now vanished completely. "Miguel, you're a waiter. Stay out of this." This time, her voice was sharp and final, stripped of the feigned gentleness from before. Miguel opened his mouth, ready to argue, but Amanda's glare made him hesitate. She had made up her mind. She wasn't going to let him interfere any further. Turning back to Keanu, she no longer bothered with pretense. If subtle hints weren't enough, if polite suggestions weren't working, then she would have to be crystal clear. Taking a deep breath, she prepared to say the words she was certain would end this situation once and for all. Miguel felt his heart pounding in his chest as he met Amanda's icy gaze, a stare that held no attempt to hide her anger and impatience. It was as if he had just crossed a line he should never have dared to step over. And yet, despite everything, he couldn't stop himself from speaking. He wasn't the type to interfere in matters that didn't concern him, especially when doing so could land him in trouble, could get him reprimanded by his superiors, or even cost him the job he had worked so hard to secure. But this time, he couldn't just stand by. He couldn't simply watch as someone like Keanu Reeves was treated as if he didn't belong, as if his presence was an inconvenience, a mistake that needed to be corrected immediately. Taking a deep breath, Miguel tried to keep his voice steady, though the determination in his words was unmistakable. "Miss Amanda, maybe you should check with the manager first." The moment those words left his lips, the entire atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. It was as if an already taut rope had been pulled just a little too hard, ready to snap at any moment. Amanda whipped around, her eyes flashing dangerously. Gone was the polite, professional mask she had maintained throughout the conversation. In her eyes, Miguel had done something utterly unacceptable. A waiter, someone at the lowest rung of Grand Oak's hierarchy, had dared to challenge her in front of a customer. He had spoken out when no one had asked for his opinion. He had disrupted a situation she should have had complete control over. She took a slow, measured breath, forcing down the rage simmering beneath her skin, But her voice had lost all traces of its previous softness. Instead, it was cold, firm, leaving no room for debate. "Miguel, you're a waiter. Stay out of this." Her voice wasn't loud, but every syllable fell like the sharp edge of a knife, a clear warning that he was stepping out of line, that he was inserting himself into a place where he did not belong, and that if he wasn't careful, he would suffer the consequences of his actions. Miguel tightened his grip on the tray in his hands, feeling the weight of the tension pressing down on his shoulders. He knew he had made a mistake. He knew that in just a few moments he might be facing his manager's disappointment, might hear a scolding for overstepping his role. But despite all of that, he did not regret speaking up, because if he stayed silent now, he would never forgive himself. Keanu remained seated, showing no signs of intervening, no attempt to stop the unfolding confrontation. But his eyes, once indifferent, merely observing, had shifted. There was something sharper in his gaze now, an intensity that suggested he was not just watching the situation unfold, but evaluating each person caught in it. Still, he said nothing. Instead, he simply lifted his glass of whiskey again, tilting it slightly in his hand, a slow, deliberate gesture that carried an invisible weight, one that made Amanda feel as if she had just lost control of the very situation she had created. And that infuriated her more than anything. Amanda had always believed she had the ability to control any situation, to manipulate conversations and steer them in the direction she desired. But this time, all the skills she had honed throughout her years at Grand Oak seemed completely useless against this man. He did not resist, yet he did not submit. He showed no anger, but he was not intimidated. His absolute calmness was like an impenetrable wall, one that her words could not crack, one that left her feeling as if she were throwing stones at something unshakable. And Miguel, the insignificant little waiter, had the audacity to stand with him. She would not let this happen. Taking another deep breath, Amanda adjusted her tone, trying to regain control. But beneath the surface, the barely contained fury in her voice was unmistakable. "Miguel, get back to your job. I won't say it again." This was not a request, it was an order. Miguel opened his mouth, ready to say something else, but then he saw Amanda's expression, the sharp, dangerous glint in her eyes, and he realized he was standing on the edge of something irreversible. If he kept going, he might lose his job. But if he backed down, he would feel like he had betrayed himself. And when he glanced at Keanu Reeves, the man who remained as composed as ever, neither upset nor rattled, something inside Miguel ignited. For the first time in his life, he couldn't just stand by. And so, despite the risk of losing his job, despite the consequences that awaited him, he lifted his chin, looked Amanda straight in the eye, and spoke, not with hesitation, but with unshakable resolve. "Miss Amanda, I don't think he deserves to be treated like this." The air in the restaurant grew heavier than ever. Around them, other diners, an elderly couple, a group of young businessmen waiting for their table, had all stopped to watch. They were completely drawn into the unfolding scene before them. Something had changed. A line had been crossed, and Amanda, who had always believed she was in control, suddenly realized she had lost it entirely. The rage she had kept restrained throughout the conversation finally erupted into a storm inside her, and this time she didn't bother hiding it. She took a step forward, her eyes razor-sharp as she stared Miguel down, her voice lowering, but carrying a threat that was impossible to mistake. "Do you have any idea what you just did, Miguel?" The entire restaurant held its breath. The atmosphere in the restaurant had become so tense it was almost tangible. Conversations hushed, and all eyes, curious, awkward, and slightly apprehensive, turned toward the corner table where Amanda stood, facing Keanu. Her face had hardened, her discomfort reaching its peak. There was no more of that artificial professionalism, no more veiling her contempt behind polite, indirect words or thinly disguised smiles. She had lost her patience. She no longer cared about subtly making this man feel unwelcome. Now, she just wanted to end this immediately. She wanted him gone so that everything could return to its proper order, where only the right kind of patrons were seated at Grand Oak's tables, where wealth, status, and prestige determined a person's worth. Clenching her fists before quickly relaxing them, she folded her arms, staring at Keanu with an unyielding gaze. Her voice was colder than ever. "Listen, sir. This is not a roadside diner. We have standards." The words sliced through the already taut atmosphere like a blade. For a moment, no one breathed. A few servers, standing at a distance, froze, their eyes widening as they realized Amanda had just said something that could never be taken back. Miguel, who had thus far tried to remain calm despite being scolded, couldn't stop himself this time. His hands trembled, and the glass he had been holding slipped from his grasp, shattering loudly against the floor. The sharp sound echoed through the eerily silent space. But he didn't care about the broken shards at his feet. His only thought was that Amanda had gone too far. Nearby diners exchanged stunned glances. Some bowed their heads, pretending to focus on their meals, while others couldn't hide their discomfort and disappointment. A few notable. Business figures began murmuring among themselves, their expressions making it clear they disapproved of how Amanda had handled the situation. And at the center of it all, Keanu Reeves remained seated, unshaken. He did not react immediately. He did not frown, did not show anger, did not rush to respond. He simply sat there, calm and quiet, observing Amanda with an expression that was both composed and piercing, as if he could see straight through her, to every thought, every hidden motive lurking beneath her carefully crafted exterior. No one spoke. No one dared to break the silence. Then, in a slow but deliberate motion, Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. There was no urgency, no sign of an emotional reaction. He scrolled through his contacts, tapped on a number, and lifted the phone to his ear. And in the absolute silence of the restaurant, his deep, steady voice resonated. "Jerry, could you bring over the ownership documents for Grand Oak and the renovation plans we discussed last week?" No one could breathe. Amanda stood frozen, the confident smile she had worn mere seconds ago now locked in place, as if her face had forgotten how to move. Her skin paled as Keanu's words began to sink in, sinking deep into her mind like the worst nightmare imaginable. Miguel, who had seen countless tense encounters between staff and customers, could not believe what he had just heard. The nearby diners, who had, just moments ago, been caught up in the tension, were now utterly speechless, their minds reeling from the weight of the revelation. Amanda blinked rapidly, desperately searching for some rational explanation for what she had just heard, but her brain felt paralyzed. She frantically sifted through her memory, trying to recall any information about a new owner of Grand Oak. Nothing. No one had told her that Keanu Reeves owned the restaurant. No one had warned her that she had just tried to kick out the very man who signed her paycheck. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her pulse hammering with panic. And yet, some small part of her refused to accept it. Number. This couldn't be real. He was bluffing. He was just trying to seize control of the situation to see if she would crack under pressure. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to steady her voice even as her clenched fists betrayed her tension. "I don't understand what you mean, sir." But before she could finish her sentence, the kitchen door swung open. A man in a tailored suit stepped inside, carrying a sleek brown leather folder. And just like that, all remaining doubt evaporated. Jerry, Grand Oak's chief accountant, a man who only appeared when major management decisions were at stake, stood there, holding the very documents that proved Keanu Reeves's ownership. The air was sucked from the room. Amanda crumbled. Her skin turned ghostly pale. Her breath came in rapid, uneven gasps as the crushing weight of her mistake crashed down on her. Miguel, who had tried to save her from this disaster, could only shake his head, speechless. And Keanu, who had remained effortlessly composed from the start, lifted his glass of whiskey, took a slow sip, and then fixed Amanda with a gaze that carried no anger, only an unshakable authority that made his next words feel heavier than any reprimand ever could. "Do you understand now?" No one dared to breathe, and for the first time in her life, Amanda had no idea what to say. Silence engulfed the entire restaurant, not the kind of tranquility that brings comfort, but the kind that signals unbearable tension, like the air itself had been compressed to the point that the slightest movement could shatter everything into pieces. Every pair of eyes was fixed on Keanu Reeves, who remained seated calmly in the corner, seemingly unaffected by the storm that had just passed. But in every movement he made, in every glance he cast, there was an unspoken weight pressing down on one person, and that person was Amanda. She did not move, she could not speak. Her entire body seemed frozen as the thoughts in her mind spiraled into chaos. All her life, she had believed she understood the world, that she knew how to read people, how to distinguish who mattered, who was worth treating with respect, and who wasn't even worthy of stepping foot into the kind of establishment she considered truly elite. But all those beliefs, all the unspoken rules she had followed throughout her career, had just been crushed in a single moment. Keanu was not angry. Not a single harsh word left his lips. Not a single gesture betrayed frustration or resentment. Instead, he silently reached for the folder Jerry had just placed on the table, flipped through the first few pages with a quiet deliberation, as if confirming something he had already known. Then, with precise intent, he placed the folder directly in front of Amanda. His gaze remained steady, not unkind, but carrying a seriousness that needed no amplification through words or authority. It simply existed within him. Thomas, the restaurant manager, stood just a few feet away, his face drained of all color. Confusion and fear filled his eyes as he realized he had failed to intervene before disaster struck. His entire career at Grand Oak might come to an abrupt end tonight, all because of a mistake he had never anticipated. A mistake that came from one of his employees committing the gravest sin in the service industry, misjudging a guest. Keanu took a sip of his whiskey, the motion so unhurried that it almost mocked the tension suffocating the room. Then, for the first time since the truth had been laid bare, he finally spoke to Amanda. "You said Grand Oak has standards." His voice was deep and steady, carrying a weight that made each word land with the force of a hammer striking cold steel. He did not need to raise his voice. The words themselves carried their own gravity, pulling the attention of everyone in the vicinity. Guests who had, until now, feigned neutrality, but could no longer pretend they hadn't heard. Amanda, trying desperately to maintain her composure, betrayed herself with the slightest tremor in her fingertips. She wanted to say something, to explain, to find an excuse that could salvage the situation. But there was nothing. She looked down at the document on the table, the bold print on the cover reading, "Transfer of Ownership and Rights, Keanu Reeves," like a slap across her perception of reality. A brutal reminder that she had gone far beyond the point of no return. Keanu tilted his head slightly. His voice was neither mocking nor triumphant, yet it left no room for escape. "So, tell me, Amanda, when you speak of standards at Grand Oak, what exactly are you referring to? The way someone dresses? The amount of money they can spend on a meal? Or something else?" No one spoke. No one dared to even breathe too loudly. Every eye in the restaurant was on Amanda, as if waiting for her to explain herself. But she had nothing to say. Sweat began to bead on her forehead, not from heat, but from the overwhelming fear closing in on her from all directions. Never in her life had she felt so small, so utterly powerless. Never had she felt so lost, as though the very foundation of the world she had built in her mind had crumbled in a single evening. Keanu's gaze never wavered from her. Those deep blue eyes seemed to see straight through her, piercing into the very core of her being, forcing her to confront the question she had always believed she understood better than anyone. But Amanda could not answer. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Because in that moment, she realized a terrifying truth. She had never truly understood what Grand Oak standards were. Her entire life, she had believed she knew luxury, class, and the way an elite restaurant should operate. She thought she knew who was worthy of service and who wasn't. But now, standing before the man she had dismissed, the man she had tried to belittle, she had no words left to defend herself. Because deep down, she knew she had been wrong from the very beginning. Keanu slowly set his whiskey glass down on the table. The faint clink of the glass against wood was soft, but carried an ominous finality, as though marking the end of something irrevocable. There was nothing more to be said, because everything had already been made painfully clear. The space around them seemed to stretch under the weight of silence, a silence that did not stem from comfort or ease, but from the sheer gravity of an undeniable truth. Everyone in the restaurant, from the waitstaff to the wealthy patrons indulging in their expensive meals, was drawn into this moment, into every word, every glance, every slightest movement of the man sitting at the corner table. The man they had assumed was just another anonymous guest, only to discover he was, in fact, the most significant person in the room. Keanu Reeves lifted his glass of whiskey again, but this time he did not drink. He merely swirled the amber liquid inside, the chandelier's light casting strange, shifting patterns on the polished mahogany table. Unhurried, without the faintest hint of tension, he placed the glass down with deliberate precision, then slowly lifted his gaze to meet Amanda's, his eyes carrying no anger, no accusation, and yet they bore a weight heavier than any rebuke. "Do you know why I sit here every Friday night?" His voice was calm, almost gentle, yet it held an authority that could not be ignored. It was not just a question. It was a doorway, leading to a truth no one in the room had dared to confront. Amanda swallowed hard, feeling her chest tighten under an invisible pressure. She didn't dare look at the file in front of her, nor did she turn to Thomas for support. Cold sweat prickled at the back of her neck, an unfamiliar sensation, a complete loss of control, an absolute vulnerability she had never experienced before. I don't know." Her voice was so small it nearly dissolved into the air, yet everyone heard it. Because in that moment, no one was whispering, no one was focused on their meals, no one could ignore what was unfolding before their eyes. Keanu nodded slightly, as if he had already known the answer but had still wanted her to say it aloud. His eyes held a quiet depth, a look of someone who had seen far more than the world assumed, a man looking at a lost soul, at someone who thought they understood everything, but in truth had never really understood anything at all. Because 6 months ago, I bought this restaurant. No one breathed. A few guests quietly set down their silverware, as if they could no longer bring themselves to eat after realizing how profoundly they had misjudged the situation. Others exchanged glances, the shock in their eyes tinged with embarrassment, because they too had thought the same way Amanda had mere minutes ago. Amanda felt her legs weaken beneath her. She had been so certain that she understood everything about Grand Oak, about the operations of an elite restaurant, about reading people based on appearances. But in this instant, everything she had believed crumbled before her. Keanu didn't leave her time to process. His voice, steady yet resonant, filled the room once more. Not for the prestige, not for wealth, not for the luxury you assume this place represents. I bought it because I wanted to preserve something real, something I experienced here long before you ever knew the name Grand Oak. I bought it because I wanted to protect something simple that so many people have forgotten. Respect. Respect for everyone, no matter who they are, no matter what they wear, no matter where they come from. The air in the restaurant felt frozen in time, because there was nothing to argue against, no way to deny the truth of his words. It was too obvious, too raw, too absolute. An elderly couple, longtime patrons of Grand Oak, nodded quietly, as if they understood the meaning behind every syllable Keanu had spoken. The younger guests, the businessmen, accustomed to society's reverence, lowered their gazes as though they had just realized that they, too, had lost something essential in their pursuit of status. Miguel, who had been watching the scene unfold from the very beginning, felt a surge of emotion. Not because he took satisfaction in seeing Amanda exposed, but because he now knew, with certainty, that he had chosen the right side. As for Amanda, her mind was blank. Everything she had built her career upon, her confidence, her ability to assess and control a situation, had vanished with a single sentence. She wanted to say something, to offer a defense, an apology, an explanation, anything to escape this crushing realization. But she couldn't. There was nothing to say, because for the first time in her life, she saw herself through the eyes of another, and it was not a reflection she had ever wanted to see. Keanu gently picked up his whiskey glass again, but this time he did not drink. He simply looked at it, as if weighing a thought in his mind, then set it down with a quiet finality. His gaze never left Amanda. "Now, tell me, Amanda, what do you think true class really is?" No one whispered. No one pretended not to hear. Everyone was waiting for her answer. But Amanda couldn't speak, because in that moment she realized she had never truly known the answer at all. Amanda staggered, her legs seemingly numb, her entire body drained of strength as she stood face to face with an irreversible reality. She had once been confident that she understood how this world operated, that she knew exactly who was worthy, who was not, that those who stepped into Grand Oak had to adhere to unspoken standards of power and status. But now, Everything she had ever believed in had been shattered in a single evening, and the worst part was that she had been the one to drag herself into the abyss. Jerry, the restaurant's chief accountant, approached, carrying a brown leather folder, carefully placing it into Keanu's hands with an undeniable air of respect. In the tension-filled atmosphere, every movement Jerry made only added to the weight of the moment, as if he were handing down an official verdict, a final and unchangeable judgment. Keanu opened the folder, not hurriedly, not ostentatiously, just skimming through the familiar words like a ritual of formality. He already knew everything inside, but the act of holding it in his hands, of placing it before Amanda, was a message that no one in the restaurant could ignore. Around them, customers began murmuring in hushed voices. Some exchanged glances of astonishment. Some still struggled to process what had just unfolded, while others looked ashamed, because they, too, had misjudged. They had all looked at the unassuming man sitting in the corner with the same assumptions Amanda had. But they were luckier. They had not been the ones to voice their condescension aloud. An elderly couple sitting nearby exchanged looks. The husband shook his head, disappointment evident in his expression, while the wife remained silent. But the way she slowly set her napkin back on the table showed that she understood, more deeply than anyone, that an important lesson had just been taught before everyone's eyes. A few steps away, Miguel clenched his fists, his lips pressed together, a whirlwind of emotions churning inside him, a mix of pride and pity. Pride because Keanu Reeves, the man he had looked up to since childhood, had once again demonstrated what true class meant. Not by raising his voice, not by flaunting his power, but simply by being who he was. And pity, because Amanda had been too blinded by arrogance to realize it sooner. Now, she had no choice but to face the consequences of her own actions. Keanu placed the folder down on the table, his gaze steady, devoid of malice or condemnation, yet offering no leniency either. He was not a man who sought to belittle others to assert his authority, but he also never allowed empty arrogance to thrive unchecked. Slowly, he laced his fingers together, his thumbs brushing against each other in a habitual gesture of contemplation. Then he tilted his head slightly, looking at Amanda, not with hatred, but with a gaze powerful enough to crush any excuses she might have tried to muster. Amanda, you said that Grand Oak has standards. She flinched slightly at the sound of her name, not just from surprise, but from the way his voice no longer carried the distance of a mere customer. It was the voice of an owner speaking to his employee, a bitter truth she had never imagined she would have to confront. So, tell me, what do you think this restaurant stands for? There was no way to evade it, no one to turn to for help, no place left to hide. Amanda opened her mouth, but no words came out. She had once believed she understood the answer better than anyone. To her, Grand Oak was not just a restaurant, it was a symbol of status, of the elite, a place where wealth and power dictated everything. In her mind, people like Keanu, though she had not known who he was at the time, did not fit the image she believed Grand Oak represented. But now, as she sat before the true owner of the establishment, hearing the question posed directly to her, she realized she had never truly understood the standards she had so arrogantly defended. The air was thick, heavy enough to feel the weight of each unspoken thought. Everyone in the room knew Amanda could not answer because they had already found the real answer themselves. Keanu did not need her to speak. He saw it all in her eyes, in the hesitation she could no longer hide. He leaned slightly forward, his voice calm but unwavering. You believed that Grand Oak's standards were dictated by appearances, by the price of a dish, by social media followings, or by the influence someone wielded outside these walls. But let me tell you a simple truth. Grand Oak's standards have never been about any of that. They are about how we treat people. Each word was spoken deliberately, not loud, but carrying more weight than any grand speech. This restaurant was built on the foundation of hospitality, not exclusion. It was created to make people feel welcome, to be treated with respect, not to be an exclusive club for those who believe they are superior just because they can afford a more expensive meal. His words were not just for Amanda. They were for everyone in the room, for those who had cast judgmental glances at Keanu, for those who had believed Grand Oak was a test of wealth rather than a place that honored human dignity. Amanda felt her mind spiral, not because she did not understand Keanu's words, but because she understood them all too well. And that understanding demolished the walls of arrogance she had spent years building. No one in the restaurant dared to speak. No one clung to outdated notions of luxury anymore. All they could do was sit in silence, absorbing a lesson they would never forget. The atmosphere in the restaurant remained steeped in tense silence, but it no longer carried the oppressive weight of judgment or panic. Instead, it was a moment of transition, a moment in which everyone present realized they had just witnessed something far more significant than lavish dinners and empty flattery. A profound lesson about humanity, about the true essence of class, about respect and humility, things that no VIP seat or fine wine could ever replace. Keanu remained seated, his gaze calmly sweeping across each face, silently acknowledging the shift in their attitudes. He was in no hurry, nor did he need anyone to utter an apology or bow their head in regret, because he knew that everything that needed to be said and done had already been conveyed, more clearly than any defense or justification ever could. Then he turned to Miguel, the young man still standing there, his eyes brimming with admiration and gratitude, the one who had not hesitated to stand up against wrongdoing despite his lowly position in the restaurant's hierarchy. He was not a man of power, nor was he someone of high status, but he possessed something that many in this room had long lost: integrity. Keanu looked at him, his voice deep but carrying absolute sincerity. "Miguel, would you like to learn how to become a head waiter?" No embellishments, no grand speeches, just a simple question, yet one that carried an opportunity, a validation of worth that had nothing to do with superficial prestige. Miguel could hardly believe his ears. He looked at Keanu, then quickly glanced around, as if to confirm that he wasn't dreaming. His heart pounded against his chest, not out of fear, but out of overwhelming joy, a feeling he had never imagined he would experience on a night like this. He nodded firmly, his voice unable to conceal his emotion and determination. "Yes, I would love to." A faint smile crossed Keanu's face, not the smile of a man bestowing charity, but that of someone who had recognized something valuable, someone worthy of trust. But then he turned to Amanda. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate and unmistakable. If his conversation with Miguel had been filled with hope and validation, then as Keanu's gaze settled on Amanda, the contrast was stark. She still stood there, but the arrogance was gone. The smug smile, the air of superiority. Everything had been stripped away. Instead, she looked like someone who had just been robbed of everything she once believed she had, as if she was struggling to come to terms with the truth she had never prepared herself to face. Keanu studied her for a long moment, as if waiting to see whether she would understand the lesson on her own. Then his voice came, slower this time, but no less resolute. "And you, Amanda, you can leave now, or you can stay and start over." No one spoke, but everyone understood that this was a defining choice. This wasn't just about keeping or losing a job. This was Amanda's one chance to correct her mistakes, to step beyond the walls she had built between herself and the people she had looked down upon. But more than that, this was an offer from the very man she had humiliated, the one she had tried to belittle, a man who could have easily cast her out without a second thought, yet had chosen instead to give her an opportunity. Her hands trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it. No one could truly understand what she was feeling in this moment, except for her. The shame of realizing her own errors, the fear of not knowing if there was still a way back, and, most painfully, the growing awareness that perhaps she had lost a part of herself long ago without even realizing it. Every eye in the restaurant was on her. Some expected her to bow her head and admit her wrongs, while others assumed she would leave, too proud to humble herself. But the truth was, no one could predict what she would do. Amanda felt her throat go dry, her breath unsteady. Her pride screamed at her to walk away, to hold on to the belief that she didn't need to lower herself, that she could walk out of this door and find another job, that she didn't need Keanu Reeves to teach her about human worth. But then, a small voice echoed in her mind, soft, yet clearer than anything else. "And if you keep going like this, do you really want to spend your whole life judging people by appearances?" She swallowed hard, her eyes flickering between confusion and an unnamed fear. I want to start over, if you'll allow me." Her voice was small, but loud enough for everyone to hear. As the words left her lips, Amanda felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a weight she hadn't even realized she had been carrying. It was a feeling she had never expected to come from letting go of her pride. But this time she knew. It was the right choice, and if she truly wanted to change, this was her last chance. Keanu gave a small nod, no triumph or arrogance in his expression, just understanding. Good. One word, but it carried the weight of a new beginning. The restaurant exhaled a collective breath, not out of pity for Amanda, but because they knew they had just witnessed something rare, a moment of true change, one that, when it happened, had the power to alter the course of an entire life. And, for the first time that evening, Amanda felt like she was finally standing on a path she had never thought she would take. Amanda stood there, her eyes brimming with tears, her voice catching in her throat as she uttered words she never thought she would say. Throughout her career, she had always believed she was never wrong, that she understood the workings of the world better than anyone else, that her decisions were based on solid principles that needed no reconsideration. But now, standing before the true owner of Grand Oak, realizing that everything she had ever believed in had been dismantled in a single night, she felt as if a part of herself had been stripped away, exposing a hollow space inside her that she had never confronted before. She had been wrong, not just in the way she had treated Keanu, but in the way she had viewed the world, in the way she had thought she had the right to judge others based solely on the standards she had set for herself. And worse, she had built her entire sense of self on that arrogance, believing it made her superior to those around her. But today, she understood that true class did not come from status, from expensive suits, or from gold-plated cocktails. It came from how a person treated others. She clenched her hands slightly, trying to steady herself, attempting to swallow down the shame rising within her, but she couldn't stop the bitter yet awakening tears from silently rolling down her cheeks. I want to learn again, if you'll give me the chance. No more fake smiles, no more excessive confidence, no more the condescending gaze of someone who once believed she had the right to judge everyone. Now, all that remained was sincerity, remorse, and above all, a genuine desire to change. Keanu did not respond immediately. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze no longer sharp with scrutiny but contemplative, as if he was making sure that the words she had just spoken were not merely a knee-jerk reaction to the predicament she found herself in, but a true choice. A decision born from real understanding, not just desperation. Then, after a silence so thick she could hear the pounding of her own heartbeat, Keanu gave a slight nod. Good. Just one simple word, but to Amanda it carried the weight of an opportunity, a door opening to a path she never thought she would take. No one in the restaurant spoke, yet every pair of eyes on her reflected a distinct shift. They no longer looked at her with contempt, no longer saw her as someone blinded by artificial glamour. Instead, they saw a person confronting her mistakes, a person willing to learn and become a better version of herself. Miguel, who had been at odds with her from the start, now felt something akin to sympathy, though not pity, nor lingering resentment. He understood that no one was born perfect, that sometimes people needed to make mistakes to truly grow and change. Keanu gently pushed the stack of documents aside. They were no longer necessary because what he had sought to achieve was never in those papers. He had no interest in flaunting his power, no need to prove anything to anyone. He only wanted to ensure that the values Grand Oak had always upheld, and would continue to uphold, were not lost. He turned to Thomas, the restaurant manager, who had stood frozen the entire time as if watching his world turn upside down. His face was still pale with fear, knowing that with just one decision from Keanu, his career could end right then and there. But Keanu made no mention of that. Thomas, I want you to make sure Miguel receives the best guidance to become a lead server. Thomas nodded quickly, almost instinctively, knowing this was a directive beyond question. Yes, sir. I will personally oversee his training. Keanu gave a small nod, then turned his gaze back to Amanda. As for you, Amanda, you will start over from scratch. Miguel will be your mentor, and I expect you to learn from him because he understands better than anyone the value of respect. No one could believe what they had just heard. Amanda, the woman who had once looked down on Miguel, who had deemed him unworthy of stepping into the social class she belonged to, would now have to learn from him, a simple server who, in reality, had more to teach her than anyone else. A complete reversal. A cold shiver ran down Amanda's spine, not from fear, but from the realization that this was what she needed to do, that this was her only chance to make things right. She bowed deeply, not out of forced humility, not out of mere compliance, but out of genuine acknowledgement of her mistakes. No trace of her old pride remained, no resistance left in her mind. I will do my best. Thank you. Keanu said nothing more. He simply lifted his whiskey glass, taking a slow sip, as if everything had finally fallen back into place, as if he had just accomplished the most important task of the night, not asserting his authority, but helping someone recognize their faults and giving them a chance to fix them. The restaurant remained silent, but the way everyone looked at Amanda had changed completely from the way they had at the start. because they had all just learned a valuable lesson, one that no book could teach, one that no luxurious establishment could ever replace. A lesson about true class. At first, it was just a single, solitary clap echoing from a corner of the restaurant. Small, yet deeply meaningful, as if someone in the crowd simply couldn't contain their admiration. But then, like a domino effect, table after table, people began to rise, clapping louder and louder. Not because they were applauding a Hollywood star, but because they knew they had just witnessed something rare and truly valuable. The young entrepreneurs who had been impatiently waiting for their tables, believing they deserved to be served first, were now clapping the hardest. They realized that they had once thought exactly like Amanda. The wealthy, the powerful, those who were used to the world revolving around them, who had grown accustomed to admiration and special treatment, now had to face a simple yet profound truth. True class does not come from money or status. It comes from who you are and how you treat those around you. The elderly couple, loyal patrons of Grand Oak, nodded quietly. Their eyes shimmered with contentment, as if they had just witnessed proof that something they always cherished about this restaurant still remained. Something beyond luxury. Something with a soul. Something money could never buy. Human value. Miguel, the young waiter, still stood there, gripping his tray tightly. But this time, not out of fear or nervousness, but out of an overwhelming sense of pride. He could hardly believe that just minutes ago he had been an anonymous server, and now he was about to train one of Grand Oak's highest-ranking staff members. It was an unexpected shift, one that he himself had yet to fully grasp. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know how Amanda would treat him in the days to come, when she would be forced to learn from him. But he was no longer afraid, because he knew he had done the right thing. And then there was Amanda. The one who had once been in control of everything now stood in the center of attention, not as a victor, but as someone who had just lost the biggest game of her life. She looked around, seeing no more contempt or hostility in the eyes of those around her. Instead, she saw sympathy, expectation, and a challenge. Because from this moment on, she was no longer the one passing judgment. She was the one being judged. Would she truly change? Could she learn the lesson that Keanu had just taught her? Or would she fall back into her old habits, her old beliefs, the ones she had relied on to build her identity? She didn't have an answer, but she knew one thing. There was no turning back. She took a deep breath and bowed her head once more. This time, not as a reluctant apology, but as a genuine surrender to reality. She had been wrong, and now she would have to start over to make things right. Keanu said nothing more. He didn't need to. Everything he wanted to convey had been made clearer than any speech could ever express. He didn't need praise. He didn't need applause or admiration. He simply picked up his glass of whiskey, took a sip, and returned to himself, as if nothing had happened, as if this evening had been just another ordinary night. Because to him, that was the true essence of class. Not showing off, not exerting power, but demonstrating one's worth quietly yet powerfully, letting it speak for itself, without ever needing to shout for recognition. And so, after a night of upheaval, Grand Oak returned to its usual quiet. But that quiet was no longer the same. It had changed. It had deepened. Because everyone who had been there tonight was no longer the same person they were when they first walked in. They had learned a truth. Class does not come from clothing or wealth. Class comes from how we treat others. And if someone were to walk into Grand Oak tonight, they might notice something different. In the corner of the restaurant, where a man had once been dismissed simply because of his plain attire, there still sat a man in a gray polo, quietly sipping his whiskey. But now, no one dared to judge him. Because now, everyone knew. He was no ordinary guest. He was the man who had taught them all a lesson they would never forget. And so, from what seemed like just another ordinary evening at Grand Oak, an unexpected story unfolded, leaving behind a profound lesson not only for those present in the restaurant that night, but for all of us. True class does not come from the clothes you wear, the money you have, or the status you hold. It comes from how you treat the people around you, from respect, humility, and the way you recognize human worth. Amanda had made a mistake in judging others by their appearance, but more importantly, she realized it and chose to start over, because it is never too late to change and become a better version of yourself. What about you? Have you ever been judged unfairly based on your appearance or status? Have you ever witnessed a situation like this in real life? Share your story in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share it so others can learn this valuable lesson, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any future content. See you in the next video.